2017. This was during Mayor Ryback's, and I'm see if I can get the term, is accelerated infrastructure program. Yes. Infrastructure acceleration program, and you can see that's where we really peaked out around 2012 as far as doing the amount of resurfacing that we were doing in those years. And perhaps Mr. Kennedy or some of our other staff are aware, but I'm not aware of any other unique or different techniques of maintaining our streets that we could implement other than reconstruction and or resurfacing. I think those are two techniques. There's obviously a number of preventive maintenance issues that we take care of, as Lisa had indicated. I think one of the new programs, though, that we are pursuing is associated with our concrete streets. We've been working on some pilots of how to properly maintain and restore our concrete streets, and I think we have a new system down that we would like to start in, and I think in 2017.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that we're having this discussion, and we'll probably have to talk about it a lot more. I was actually living in the city in 1964, and I remember what they did then. I also had a chance to talk to one of my predecessors, Bob McGregor, who was a council member back then, and that's when they decided the ticket for the future was concrete streets. And so a lot of that investment in those new streets were the concrete streets, which subsequently, being on the council, I've discovered are very challenging to maintain when they start to fall apart. We did a pilot project about what to do about concrete streets in the Seward neighborhood while I was on the council, and I think it was somewhat successful, but it was very different than resurfacing. So we can't just go in and mill and overlay the concrete streets. And so I think that's a critical part of this is how are we going to address the problem with the concrete streets. Now, some have been torn up and reconstructed, and the way we do it now is we don't replace it with a concrete street. At least I'm not aware that we ever have. So we're replacing them with asphalt, which is interesting. So it makes me wonder or think something that might be helpful as we have this discussion forward is to look at where are the failing streets, so sort of have geography overlaid with time so that we could see. And this also makes me wonder about where in the city that we're going to be suffering the most in terms of our streets all going south or going into poorer and poorer conditions. And I'm imagining a lot of those will be the concrete ones. And I was also curious if, because the majority of the streets appear to be the residential streets, and that's also been challenging for us in terms of funding. It always seems easier for us to reconstruct an MSA street because we have some aid and some help. But 50%, at least I think according to that first pie chart, or one of the early pie charts, 50% of the streets are residential streets. Well, I have a hunch that probably a lot of those are the concrete streets that we were kind of in charge of, and those are the residential streets. So that's probably an area where we really have to think about it, and it would be good to get some more information about how much does it cost to do this, not resurfacing, but the kind of, I'm not sure what you call the process that you use on the concrete streets, but that repair, temporary repair short of reconstruction, and how does that compare with reconstruction, and how does that add to life, just to find out how big a problem those concrete streets are going to be. And you may be able to weigh in a little bit and give me a little feedback now, so I'll be quiet and let you do that.
Yeah, Councilmember, I do believe, and staff can certainly fill in details, but yeah, we do have some analysis that gives us some estimates of, I believe it's concrete rehabilitation efforts. And so it's certainly less than reconstruction, but it's still more than asphalt resurfacing. So it's definitely a tool that we're going to need to utilize, I believe, to at least flatline some of our pending peaks and valleys. And as a matter of fact, it seems like we've got now a century plus of data. We now know what a modern street system takes over its life cycle of 60 plus years. You have to establish it, you have to maintain it, stretch it out, be fiscally responsible in terms of getting as much value out of an initial baseline investment. But at a certain point, the road, which we mostly think of the surface, is actually the underlying conditions and the ability to move water. Water is the enemy of the street. And once that underlying condition caves out, water collects, and then your gutter system goes, and then you just don't really have a modern road at that point in time. And so it's kind of the reset button. And so now that we know what we have in terms of the life cycle, where you kind of have a peak and then a valley, and they're kind of inversely related, reconstruction, maintenance, I think we can maybe do longer term projections. And then I think in terms of getting more life cycle out of certain streets, because again, we have flat line averages, but there are different tails out there. A lot of it has to do with the condition of the underlying area. For example, the soils can have a big impact on what the actual life cycle of a particular stretch of road would be. And of course, if there's sort of inclines and declines where water collects, or there's more aggressive, odd, curious truck use in an area that wouldn't normally have it at an intersection that's mostly quiet, but then maybe there's one busy connector intersection where you see a lower condition. So all these things, I think, could maybe find ways where we could stretch the line out, but it's inevitable that there would be a baseline reconstruction need for the system over time. That's, I think, inevitably demonstrated.
So am I right in guessing that the concrete streets are mostly the residential streets?
No.
Some of them are MSA? None of them are. Some of them are local and some are residential? Could I just get a little more on that?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, we have basically I'll answer, kind of go back a little bit too. The street systems that we have, the different types of streets are state trunk highways, our county roads, our MSA streets, municipal state aid streets, which are funded by gas tax or eligible for gas tax money, our residential streets, and then our local streets. The local streets are I created that name, local streets, back 25 years ago when I was doing the pavement management program. You take MSA, CSA, STH, residential streets. The residential streets are the ones that were built as part of the residential paving program, and they are identified that way. When you add up all those streets, you have some left over, and those are the local streets. They tend to be the industrial levels. They're minor arterials and things like that. They are just streets that don't fit into a category otherwise. We have about 650 to 700 miles of residential streets. When we started the residential paving program back in 1965, that was the result of the hue and cry of the public because we had these terrible streets that were blowing up. They were just oil dirt streets. And so they embarked on the residential paving program and created the bonding and the assessment protocols and the LWEL system for it. About, of those 700 miles, there are 150 miles of concrete paved streets in the city. Originally, when they started the residential paving program, they actually would give the neighborhoods a choice. Do you want concrete? Do you want asphalt and things like that? Because concrete and asphalt were relatively the same cost, and they were competitive. And if there was ability to give residents a cost, they would pick. Over time, the cost of a concrete street construction became more cost prohibitive than asphalt, and so we went into an asphalt paving program, and that's basically what's there. The concrete streets are sprinkled in amongst about, I think, 10 to 20% of the residential streets. Some of the, many of the local streets are concrete surface, and a few of the MSA arterial system as well. Again, nowadays, concrete and asphalt is becoming competitive again with each other. And so we have done some streets in surface concrete. We rebuilt 54th Street that was concrete in concrete. Richfield Road down around Lake Calhoun was done in concrete. We've done some other things and have that ability to do that. And a lot of times it's an engineering judgment based on cost effectiveness and underlying soils and things like that will dictate an engineering decision around concrete versus asphalt and a cost thing. Concrete streets tend to last longer and have, without doing anything to them, they'll tend to last longer than an asphalt street. But when they go, as somebody had mentioned earlier, when they go hard. And we've developed this renovation pilot programs looking at the best practices in the industry for renovating concrete. And that was the pilot project we did in Seward and then up around in the first ward, Cabell Park. and we're looking for another place to do a little bit more this year to really get a good experience. So we have a good experience on how to maintain and renovate concrete streets now. You can't do the same. We've had a long-standing, very aggressive program of preventative maintenance of seal coating on the asphalt streets, but we have not had a program to renovate concrete streets or do preventative maintenance. We do some joint sealing and things like that, which helps, but not an organized program over time. So we're at the point now where the bulk of the concrete streets are at a point in their life cycle where they need more aggressive work like the renovation, which is more expensive, and or reconstruction, because most of the concrete streets are the oldest streets in the city. I've been rambling. Did I get to your question?
Yeah, I appreciate that extra information. I really was looking for that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wondered if we could get some more detail about the financial and budgetary implications of the presentation. So the way I'm reading it, we have a $300 million gap, looking at $30 million annually over 10 years. Is that the total investment? And then how much of that would be, how would we typically pay for that? So this would be bonding, there would be assessments. Do we know what the average annual cost in bonding would be and how that might translate into how we would pay for that through our annual budgets?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, so the $300 million or the $30 million a year is a gap. So that's not the total funding, that is just the gap. And that is to achieve a goal of an average PCI of 70. We could talk, and probably it'd be best to do it at a follow-up meeting regarding funding opportunities. We have talked to the finance department about, well, to do $30 million additional funding, what would that equate to as far as bonds and property tax increases and so forth. But we weren't going to get into funding scenarios today. One of the things I just want to also summarize is that, the need, as you can see, is primarily around the issue of reconstruction. And that's because, it is such an expensive piece of work compared to, say, resurfacing and so forth. Some of the other advantages, though, as we move forward with trying to do more reconstruction is associated with the functionality of the streets. We've been talking a lot about what I call just pavement condition and so forth, but as we move forward on reconstructions, that is also a great opportunity to really change some of the functionality issues of the streets associated with our, as we move forward with our complete streets policy. The other thing that I also just want to indicate that the $30 million gap is associated with a goal of PCI of 70. And I think as we've discussed this in the past, that's awful. That's very challenging. Obviously, it's a lot of dollars each year. What I do want to make sure everybody understands, this is a scalable number. So that if we're not able to obtain a $30 million increase for our street systems at some point, that something less will still be beneficial. That the 30 million is a number associated with trying to achieve a goal of 70, PCI of 70, which I think is good. But on the other hand, if we can't raise that many dollars for that gap, some percentage less than that is still beneficial. So
that's helpful. Thank you. Could I ask how did the city pay for the infrastructure acceleration program that was done?
Perhaps I could ask Mr. Wingenius to answer that question, since he was very involved in that program.
Council member, I can't remember both. There were two influxes of money into the infrastructure acceleration program. One of the two was liquidating proceeds from the sale of the Hilton Hotel. The Hilton Hotel Fund, which was, prior to that point, was used for development projects in the city and was thought of as a rainy day fund. I recall Mayor Ryback in one of his budget addresses saying to the council, it's raining. It's time to use the rainy day fund. I would note, however, that it was a very it was a very conscious decision amongst the mayor and council members at the time that this was using a one-time source like the Hilton Hotel and liquidating that for the sake of an ongoing need was understood to be buying time. It was never thought of as something that would be a long-term solution. It was meant specifically to meet the recommendation of the Public Works Director that if we did have a one-time source of funds which will allow us to resurface streets and extend their life in the manner described by Lisa Cerny, that would buy us time. That wasn't the only source. There were two sources, and if there's somebody else in the room who can remember the other, but that was one of the two sources for the Infrastructure Acceleration Program. But they were both one time, and I think we're already past the end.
I do have a comment. Mr. Chair, if there are no more questions. I really appreciate this discussion. I think this is timely because we are in the midst of a discussion in our city about parks funding as well. And so I think it's important for us to all keep in mind as elected officials and council members who are going to have to figure out how to pay for all of these needs. People love their parks, and that's important. My constituents actually have a lot of questions about the parks funding requests. And now we have an understanding of how much need we have in our own streets infrastructure. So for me, it's really important that when I'm making decisions about different funding requests, that to keep in mind this big picture of the city's infrastructure needs. It seems irresponsible to me to make commitments for some of our capital needs and without the context of understanding all of this pending road funding needs as well. So I really appreciate this presentation at this time.
Thank you, Councilmember. I think it's definitely a timely conversation, and as Director Kaki alluded to, this is a statewide conversation, and of course with a presentation like this and the data collection and presentation of the data as we know them and the projections as we foresee them, we're looking at the situation head on. We're not taking a head in the sand approach to our situations and our responsibilities of our system. I know bridges, sometimes get a lot of attention, in the statewide conversation, but there's a lot of underlying sort of workhorse infrastructure that also needs tending to, and I don't think we're any different than Bemidji or any other communities, except for maybe the timing of when we started. So we might be looking at this in a particular way now. 20 years from now, even the Burnsvilles of the world will be looking at their situation in a similar fashion. It's engineering, it's physics, it's no escaping it really. And so I do appreciate that, and kind of as we've also alluded that there will be more conversation in terms of how now that we know what our challenges are, how we meet them financially. And I suppose to that end, stay tuned. Any further questions? Seeing none, again, thanks staff for this presentation, and we are now adjourned.